All right, so we're live now. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. James Broomall, an associate professor of history at Shepherd University, as well as the director of the George Southern Center for the Study of the Civil War. And with me today is a Shepherd alumna, Melanie Garvey. I had Melanie throughout the early part of my time at Shepherd. Oversaw an excellent capstone project / presentation that she had done on the confluence of technology and women's fashions. And since that time, Melanie has flourished as a public historian. And I was very excited to bring her on today in the capacity that she currently serves, which is the archivist for the Clarke County Historical Society. This is an organization that I think interfaces with a lot of interesting history, and they're developing, as we'll talk about today, a very interesting project about a letter group from an African-American family that lived in the Millwood area in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th centuries. So with that, I'll just briefly say that we are indeed living through both extraordinary and disturbing times, and that, you know, we as private citizens can do a whole host of different things depending upon your levels of engagement and the course that you travel. But as an academic historian and as a public historian and archivist, I think our roles largely pertain to the area of historical context, and in many cases engaging source materials that perhaps audiences have been exposed to before, encouraging audiences perhaps to think differently about the past. And so I'm very excited about today's presentation and the specific letter group with which we're going to be working. So while I'm still in my parents' house and my internet connection isn't ideal, nonetheless on, and we will do a screen share today and show two of these letters, one dating from 1912 and one dating from 1915. And we'll encourage audiences to sort of engage with those documents and think about these source materials. So you doing well, Melanie?
Yep, doing good.
Good, okay. I think it would be useful to start today just by talking a little bit about your career path. You've obviously worked at a number of different historic sites, and I think audiences are always very interested in how people sort of get where they are and how those things unfolded. So just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you arrived in Clarke County.
Yeah, so I graduated officially in 2017, I think. And it's funny because I did not like public history as an undergrad, and here I am as a public historian, which I tell at a lot of parties. But I immediately after graduating, my fiance moved to Texas. He's a public school teacher. And so I thought, what a great time, I'll go with him. And so I ended up on the Gulf Coast of Texas for about 4 years. And down there is a whole different place. Big culture shock. I was not prepared for the types of history that I was going to encounter, the types of parks I was going to encounter. But I ended up having a lot of fun. So I did an internship in Shepherd, during Shepherd at Harper's Ferry. And so I was very used to costume interpretation. I was fully immersed in the living history world. So my first kind of introduction into Texas history, it was the George Ranch Historical Park. It's a living, working ranch on, I think, the park part is about 523 acres. Don't quote me on that. But it's a living, working ranch staffed by costume interpreters, and we interpreted a little over 100 years of Texas history. The first family that we start with moved down during the colonization of Texas during the early 1820s, and then it ended about 100-ish years later in the 1920s with the very last generation of family members who lived on the property. So I interpreted all of that history. I faced a lot of very difficult topics down there. Anybody who's familiar with the Gulf Coast, they're still not comfortable tackling the topic of slavery, like a lot of places are. They're not unique in that. And the plantation that I worked at was just that, it was a plantation. So we got to kind of deal with that. The family is still alive, so we had to handle their wishes and also appropriately educate the public. I had a blast. It was a lot of fun. And we ended up moving after about a year there. We moved to a different location. So that commute no longer became possible. It was about an hour, which was crazy. So I ended up at the Lake Jackson Historical Museum, which was a traditional museum. I no longer did costume interpretation, and that's where I got my introduction into digital archiving and digital humanities. Another internship that I did during my Shepherd years was at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick.
Great.
And yes, I actually did 2 internships with them. So I asked them to come back on afterwards to finish my project, which never went live. This is me yelling at you. But I developed the back work for what was supposed to be a really cool digital exhibit about the Pry House. And I had a lot of fun doing that. And so when I was in Lake Jackson, I channeled kind of that training and the fun I had with that project into an app that we developed. So it's a third-party software. I didn't do any of the coding. I'm not that good, but I was able to take the regional history. Lake Jackson got its name from a plantation owned by the Jackson family on Lake Jackson. And it was a sugar plantation. And so we were able to take a lot of the records that still exist from the peoples who worked there. It became a prison farm after the family left. And it's still, the ruins still exist today, and it's still a public park. So I took a lot of those records and I was able to put them into something really cohesive. It was a really cool project. And then I left. So the beauty of public education is that not everywhere pays as well as it should. So we decided that we were not super happy with my fiance's work in Texas. So we, I guess a little over a year now, just about a year now, moved back. So he's now teaching locally, and I, on a whim, not to lie, applied to the Lake Jackson the Clarke County Historical Association. I get them confused often. And as their archivist, I have informal archival training. I've worked at archives in the past. I'm very familiar with the process. I just don't have an official degree. And Nathan, my boss, hired me. So I've been here for about a year. And I love every second of it. So that's my brief journey.
Good, good. Well, I think it's always interesting how people sort of end up where they are. And those viewers who are starting to tune in, we have some friends from Colorado and Maine who have been regulars thus far. So welcome. As always, I hope everyone is doing well. I think that these historic sites are very important arbiters in how we understand the past and how we engage the past. And I think you gave voice to that very clearly and powerfully about your experiences in Texas, and you're carrying those experiences on here today in Virginia. And so with that, I want to sort of orient our viewers. Again, we have people from the West, the Northeast, the heart of West Virginia. Rick Wolf, hi Rick. Cameron Mallow, he may remember, is up in Gettysburg. And so the Shenandoah Valley flows south to north, which is very important because even though we're living in the northern parts of Western Virginia, or what becomes West Virginia for us, we're in what's known as the lower valley. And that, again, is just a feature of the topography, geography, and then the water flows. So the lower valley is the region that we're going to be referring to. And what we're talking about are areas like Frederick County, Jefferson County, which is my home, Clarke County, which Melanie will talk about. And so can you give our audiences some historical orientation here about what Clarke County looks like, especially in relationship to the broader lower valley, because it's a region set apart, and we can talk a bit about why that is here in a minute, but just paint us a broad picture.
Yeah, Clarke County, I had no idea. I'm from the area, of course, so when I came back, I had no idea that Clarke County was its own weird little county of its own. I say that with complete love. But it is very small. It's very dedicated to maintaining its historic structure. So there's a lot of regulations about businesses that can and can't come in. Developments are pretty restricted, and they're really proud of keeping their kind of historic footprint throughout the county, which is really awesome. I don't know the modern demographics, but we're a very white county. I think maybe like 4% are not considered white in the county. And we're mostly agrarian. We have been from the start. We were formed in about 1836. And we are a bit of a bleed over from the Tidewater community. So we're very agrarian, we're very large scale, and we don't have a lot of incorporated towns. I think Berryville's the town seat, and we have White Post and Boyce, don't yell at me if I get those wrong, are the only incorporated towns, and we have several other small communities throughout, but that's about it. It's really small. It's nothing like Frederick County. It's nothing like Jefferson County, Berkeley County, Loudoun County.
Yeah, and I'm going to pause you here for a minute because you made a quick reference to it, but I think it's very important to understand this one fact. The Shenandoah Valley itself, European settlers start coming down in the 1730s. Throughout much of the 18th century, it has relatively low rates of slaveholding, and by low, I mean as opposed to or compared to the Tidewater and the Piedmont. But after the Revolutionary period, there's a large number of the plantation aristocracy that move into the area of what's today Millwood. And with them comes tobacco culture. With them comes, as you said, the plantation economy, the plantation complex. And so very quickly, Clarke County looks quite different from, even though it wasn't yet incorporated, it looks quite different from the rest of the valley. And so as we were talking about before the program, it has not quite, but almost a Black majority. And that's extraordinarily unusual for the lower valley. Jefferson County sits around 28% of the population's enslaved by the 1860 census, but Clarke County, it's near 50% are enslaved by the 1860 census. And that community has shifted demographics radically over the course of the past 150 years. But I think it's important to sort of understand that context and understand this as a region not set apart because it practices agriculture like the rest of the valley, but they do a lot of cash crop economy, which is unusual for most of the valley, which is heavy in wheat production, hemp, rye, and so on, largely farmed by, as we're saying, yeoman farmers. And again, there's a lot of important research that nuances that broad picture that I just painted. Jonathan Norales, our friend over at Shenandoah University, is coming out with an excellent study on Frederick County, Winchester particularly, talking about race and slavery in the postbellum era. Cedar Creek, our friends at Cedar Creek Bell Grove are doing fantastic work in this regard. And so it's a little more nuanced than I said, but Clarke County is different, suffice it to say. So get us into the post-Civil War era then, and so we can start sort of segueing into the specific layer group that we're going to be talking about today, and what does the county look like in the postbellum years?
Yeah, so post-Civil War, we are very much like a lot of other Southern towns. Jim Crow laws are very huge. There's a lot of racial segregation. You see it all over the county. It's not unique to Clarke. It's all over the southern region. I'm looking, here we go. And you start to see a lot of divide form between, you still have this very wealthy form of plantation owners. They still stay very wealthy and they maintain their wealth. Even through to this day, a lot of families still kind of exist in the same spheres, not the same roles, but same spheres that they did And you start to see a rise of lower middle classes as the former enslaved population kind of comes back into the county. They establish lives for themselves. We never really have a very large free Black population, even antebellum during the war. And so immediately after the war, a lot of the enslaved population will leave. They will leave the county, but they do sort of come back a few years later. And we start to get a lot of the unincorporated towns I mentioned earlier start out and to some extent stay as African-American communities. Millwood is one of them. Josephine City is the first Black city established in Clarke County. You get Boyce, Bristow, Gaylord, Pigeon Hill, Piletown. They all kind of start out as African-American peoples coming back in. They are purchasing land from the landed white families who are no longer able to support themselves. And then you get these communities that pop up. Not a lot of research has been done on them. We don't know, aside from kind of the very basics, we don't know very much yet, which is kind of what this project, we'll get into that later, but kind of what this project is about. But we do have some Black voters, which is really awesome, I think. There's a very large outpouring of non-white voters in the county, especially very early around the 1880s. And then as we get into the 1900s, we get more African-American schools. We get a little bit closer to segregation. We get the population kind of starts to rise a little bit Black to white. You don't get quite such a big divide. And then now, of course, it's a bigger divide, but it fluctuates there around the turn of the century. We get a lot of African-American laborers in the county. So they're not just farm laborers, they're not just millers, but we get cobblers, we get coopers, we've got liverymen, tailors, seamstresses, grocers, you name it. We've got blacksmiths, they're occupying kind of everything. It's really awesome.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Melanie. I'm going to touch on that again. Thank you to the viewers commenting and chiming in here. And I just want to make this broad observation. While there is a lot written about sort of postbellum Virginia, there's not a lot written about the postbellum Shenandoah Valley. And that's something that I discovered as I was doing a historic resource study for the National Park Service on Cedar Creek Belle Grove. It was shocking to me. I mean, it is wide open in terms of the scholarship. Again, Jonathan Norales has got to make a really important contribution and has made contributions through his scholarship. But it was just remarkable to me how little has been done. And source materials, but the source materials are quite particular, which will get us into, I think, the project that is the centerpiece of today. And so we are concerned today in this program about really two individuals. One is Israel Spencer Jackson, and then the other is Dora Jackson. So tell us a bit about Israel and Dora. And so we have now sort of a broad view of Clarke County during the postbellum era, an understanding of a region that again is different from the rest of the lower valley, but is experiencing some of the same fundamental inequities as the rest of the white South and as the rest of the South and pockets of the North, actually, with the rise of Jim Crow, with the rise of segregation. Resources are distributed unequally, but get us down into now the micro level and talk a bit about these two figures, how Clarke County came to the letter collection, if you know that tale, and then just a bit about their lives.
Yeah, so I'll start with how we found the letters first. That'll kind of set the stage. But Clarke County Historical Association has moved locations in its past. So at one point, we were in the old courthouse, and I was not around for this. This is the the late 1930s, between and then the like 40s and 50s-ish. So was not here for any of this. However, the best of my understanding is that not a lot of the documents that we discovered. A lot of them now are in our collection. They didn't originally belong to us, but we just kind of found, I'm using the royal we, just kind of found them laying around in either the attic or the basement of the courthouse. And so this particular letter group was found in a box of papers belonging to Charles Brown, who was the Commonwealth's attorney around 1904-ish for Berryville. And he was a very prominent lawyer, goes on to be the mayor of Roanoke, I think. And so we had no idea why these letters were in here. It turns out we can't officially say there's a connection. We are still exploring that avenue, but it does look like Charles Brown was a lawyer who did handle a lot of African-American cases. He was the defense attorney for the last Black man, or last man in general, hung in Clarke County, who happened to be Black. He was involved in a lot of probate records. We find his name in transfer records. So the connections there, we're just sure yet. But so we found these letters and they stand out really far from a bunch of lawyer papers. And so we start reading them, and my volunteer, Jean, who's been fabulous, she's been helping me with them. She's the one who initially discovered it. And so we were reading them and they were just full of such great stuff. So Israel Jackson is the man who writes most of these letters, and he's born, his birth date is contested, but he's born around 1883 to 1889, depending on kind of which record you look at. By all accounts, and this is a completely gut reaction right now, just based on kind of what I know of the area and the people, we think he's a slave descendant. His family is from Millwood, and as far as I can trace them back, they stay kind of in that Millwood area. And around Millwood were all the plantations. And so I have a very strong suspicion. I have no proof of that, and I'm working on it, but he is a laborer. He doesn't really have steady work. He kind of floats around and finds jobs where he can. And these letters are written to his first wife, Dora, who is a complete mystery. We know her name, we think we know her birth date, we might know her parents' name. We haven't been, we've been unable to find her anywhere. Dora is a very unusual name for the county. You don't see a lot of Doras, you don't see really a lot of Dorothys, especially in this time period. And we think she's born around 1895, which is very strange because that would put her at about 15 when she gets married in 1910. Which, I mean, there's a case for that, but it feels off. So I'm not sure that I buy that completely. But by all accounts, she's from Millwood, maybe. We think she ends up in Philadelphia at the end of all of this. We have no record of that. We can't find her anywhere. But those are the two. And so we get a very brief snippet of their very contentious marriage. It does not seem to be very happy at all. It does leave fabulous stuff for us to kind of explore. Did I hit all those points? Was that?
Yeah, I think it's just worth making the general observation that in many cases, we're actually working through a lot of sort of official records to understand the texture and pace of daily life for African Americans in the postbellum era. So we're historians, often public historians, academic historians, rely upon census data, court records. It's a pretty specific view, and it's not terribly enlightening in terms of the specifics of these individuals' life experiences. And so that's what makes the letter collection, I think, just so extraordinarily unusual, actually. And even though it is relatively brief, it's a much more intimate view than one could otherwise get through things like the census, for instance.
Oh, absolutely. And we've been relying very heavily on census records, birth, marriage, and death records to kind of place the people within the context of the letters, within the context of the land. So you get a very intricately woven blanket of information that then, as we come to understand more of the time period and the area and the people, we can unfold and really, really delve into. When we started, this was just going to be a cool transcription project because these are really fun. And then we just kept going. And there's so much stuff left to unpack. We haven't touched the surface of it at all.
Okay, wonderful. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move us around a bit here. So I'm going to do a screen share, and I'll share with the viewers the letters themselves. Because of the screen share, I'm not going to be able to see any comments. I'll go back to the comment section after we've gone through it, but we're going to present two letters, one from 1912 and one from 1914 or 15. 15, I apologize, 15. 14, okay. Well, we'll see in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and do the screen share here and bring up our letters. Okay. So you can see this? Okay.
Yeah, I can see it on my end. So I'll just read a brief little bit at the top if you want.
Yeah.
Okay, so I won't read the whole thing to you, but it starts out to Dora, who's in Winchester at this point, from Israel, who is in Boyce. And he says, we have just a brief note. We have typed them as true to the original as possible. I am not going to read what is typed. I'm going to read it in a modern English translation just for my own brain. So he says, hello, Dora. I received your letter. It was good to hear from you. I'm sorry to say. If you told me a lie, will you tell me about it? This letter leaves me feeling much better. I don't think you're telling me a lie, but I do want to, I want to see what happens. And he kind of goes on and he rambles a lot. He does that in a lot of his letters. And so I'm not going to read the center part, but it kind of skips down at the end after talking more and more about her potential lie. He's like, I want you to look good to me. I'm going to come next week. I'm going to come visit you. He says Aunt Frances Burl is dead and buried. There was a dance out at Piletown. And there was a fight out there, and Joshy Harris got his throat cut and a gash on his face, and the leader's cut in one arm. He says, it's 5 o'clock, so I've got to go back to work. I'm in Boyce. Goodbye. And this is a pretty standard format for most of his letters, but I'll let you guys read the rest of it for yourself here.
And I'll just say briefly, the texture and the pace of this letter is pretty similar to what we see both among Black and white Southern, Northern audiences in the late postbellum into the early 20th century. You see, a familiarity certainly with Ryan Protocol, but the punctuation is kind of choppy. The presentation is kind of choppy, but they nonetheless are very revealing letters, and they're very intimate portraits. And I think what also is so interesting about these types of correspondence is that it gives you some sense of how different the pace of communication was in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. I mean, today, if we're involved in some sort of heated discussion with someone, we have a sort of instantaneous response, theoretically, by text message or by phone or by whatever mode. Whereas in the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, it can be a much more elaborated process of sort of understanding and misunderstanding, and letters sort of heighten that sense of understanding and misunderstanding. So we're kind of thrown in the middle of this drama, and it's actually kind of confusing, right? Something clearly had happened, and there seems to be some duplicity, but what prompted it's unclear. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. We don't have a single letter from Dora. We do not get her voice at all throughout this collection. And even from the very first letter, I think this is one of the first ones we have. I think there might be like one or two in front of it. But even from the very first, we don't know the specifics. We have this giant mystery. We have no idea what's going on. And there's some very serious accusations that get thrown around here, and we have no idea. Are they founded? Are they unfounded? What's going on? No clue. It's such a mystery.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the share for a minute and see if we have any specific questions that have been prompted. Yeah, so So one of our viewers notes rightfully, can you imagine waiting a week for a reply? And you see this all the time in this type of correspondence where people are like really suffering and they're just gripped with uncertainty because they can't get the communication fast enough. And so I think it just textures relationships in a really different way than what we understand. I think the other maybe insight that could be gleaned from this is there's some sense of violence, correct? I mean, it seems as though Israel has been involved or like part of a situation that deteriorated pretty rapidly as well. Do you, again, know anything further about that?
I'm able to tell you kind of the basics of it. So I've found no records, which is not surprising. Piletown, which is one of the towns I mentioned earlier, is from the start an interracial community. So there are Black people living right next to white people in the same unformed community, which is very strange. You don't typically see that sort of integration that early on. It starts around the 1870s. But we know that they were, we know that Joshie Harris, whose name is Joshua, and we know that Israel, and I'm assuming Dora, we have no evidence, but I'm assuming, are Baptists. And so the dance out at Piletown, and you see references to like camp meetings and union meetings throughout. So I'm assuming what's going on here is that this ended up being either some sort of farm dance or some sort of religious meeting, and things got pretty heated. That's the extent of my knowledge. I'm not surprised to not find any record of this, but you do find a lot of references casually to violence throughout his letters to Dora. He mentions death a lot. He mentions there's a potential knife fight of some sort going on. Yeah, this is the one we don't know much about, but the rest of them I can't answer. We've been able to find a lot of the other references.
Well, I think it prompts the good question that one of our viewers has posed, and it's our friend, Dr. Peter Carmichael from Gettysburg College's CWI, so hi, Pete. And, he asks, and I think this is useful for our audience to think about, how do we as public historians, academic historians, how do we interpret silences in letters? So what do we do when we get frustrated with material like this?
That's a good one. I never like to kind of, I have to phrase my answer very carefully. Silences and letters are really hard because you don't know kind of what's going on. Because I've spent so much time kind of with these letters and in this atmosphere, we can guess what happened. We can figure out what the racial tensions are. We can figure out what the community actions are, but we'll just never know. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that any vaguer than that, any more vaguely.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think, and maybe I'm making too much of this, but I feel there's like this obligation that I assume when I read someone else's correspondence. I mean, you're delving into the private lives of individuals who may not have wanted their lives to be public, and so that's why some historical actors frankly burned their letters. They didn't want aspects of their life to be ever known publicly or discussed publicly by people like me and you. So I think there's this real sense of obligation when I look at any sort of letters and any sort of source materials. As again, I don't want to use the word sacred, but I almost feel it's like a sacred obligation. And so I think on the one hand, these source materials can be really difficult to work with, but I think there's an extreme obligation to work with them if they do survive. And even if they can be frustrating documents that don't give us a complete story, it's our job as public historians to provide as much historical context as possible. And so whereas we have only a limited snapshot, we don't even have Dora's voice. I mean, think about that. We don't even have Dora's voice. It's gone. It's gone. And we know so little about and there's some questions that are coming in about the nature of the relationship that we're going to get to here. There's so little about her, but we do have Israel's voice, which is actually quite common. We often have male voices dominating the archives, not always, of course, but it's very common. It's a common problem. And from that, we can sort of start to draw out, we hope, wider information, wider inferences about the pace and texture of life in the community.
Yeah.
And sorry, I'm reading some of our comments here. So let me try to parse this out quickly. Is it true that Israel and Dora spent much of their relatively contentious marriage separate from one another? Is that true or no?
That is the impression we are getting. There are a few references. We never have direct evidence that they are in the same place together. We don't know how they met. We don't know where they're living. There are some references that they together have a house in Boyce. We don't know if that's true. We don't know where. We're working on kind of hopefully tracking that down, but again, it's really tough to find traces of rentals in this period. We think they may have been together for a brief moment in Philadelphia. Israel does go visit. We don't know if it's work related, if it's personal, how long he stays, but we think he's up in Philadelphia with her for a little bit. But that's it. Those are the only times we see them even remotely together, which is a very big source of contention. So I'm willing to comfortably say, no, they're not together for very much of their married life.
And do we know if this is a product of economic constraints, insofar as to say it sounds like Israel's working maybe 20 plus miles away from the area of Boyce and then Millwood?
I have a few speculations on this, and they are strictly speculation. We don't know. But I just remembered, we do have one newspaper reference, I think coming out of Richmond, that places them in jail together. They have been accused of poisoning mules in Millwood. So based on that, I still think they're mostly apart, but we do see a little bit of overlap. That's way after the scope of the letters, so it's not brought up ever. But I think the reason that they are apart is most likely an economic thing. The Israel family, the Jackson family, Israel's family, seems to be very poor. They own land in Millwood, but it's not until 1880 that they build a house, and I have no evidence that they live in the house. They just have a building on their property. And I don't know kind of where they end up after that. Dora's family, I really want to say she's originally from Philadelphia, and either she's originally from Philadelphia or her relatives are in Philadelphia, and that's her connection. But she does move around a lot, and she functions as a domestic servant. And I think this is the speculative portion here. I think she's a bit of a troublemaker in her personal and professional life. She seems to always be working for different people. She's always kind of elusive, even to her husband. And so I think Dora just maybe got married too young and wasn't ready to settle down. Very, very speculative, but there's a lot of evidence that kind of leans that direction. So I think it's mostly economic, though, is what.
Okay. Thank you. And I'll make the broader observation here. The frustrations that Melanie's experiencing, and I've experienced in some of my work, trying to recapture African-American life in the Valley, is a reflection of the power structure of the 19th and 20th centuries. There's a very specific reason why certain sources were privileged by these individuals. Certain sources survive in large quantities. And so it's a reflection of this larger structure that existed in this society, who wielded power, who had the ability to archive, to write, to record, and so there's something to be mindful of. And again, I just applaud the efforts of you and your partner in crime, as you said,
Yeah.
in trying to not only transcribe these materials, but then create a project that's going to eventually, as I understand it, make them accessible to public audiences. Is that correct?
We would like to. We did not expect this to be as big as it was. And the more we dig, the more we really would like to publish them in some capacity and make them available and a resource that frankly everybody needs to have access to.
Sure. Yeah. And just so we understand too, I mean, these are quite literally mailed letters. They're not hand delivered by friends or associates. Okay.
A few times you find courtesy of, so they're delivered to employers and then passed on to the employee in both Israel and Dora's case, but they are mail letters. They're sent snail mail. I don't know that we know how long it takes from the time of writing to get delivered, but it's a while. It's definitely a while.
Yeah, and in that area, I mean, it wouldn't be as bad perhaps as we think, but you know, maybe a week at the most. But
yeah. Oh yeah.
But let me go back to the materials themselves. So I'm going to bring up the next letter, if that's okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So let me go ahead and do another screen share here, and thank you all for bringing in your questions, which I'm trying to address as able. And so here we go.
All right, and this is, okay. Yes, okay, just want to make sure I have the right one. So I'll do the same thing. I'll just kind of overview for you. But this is to Dora, courtesy of Mrs. Adams, from MH. And we don't know who MH was, in Millwood. And this person says, dearest, yours was received this morning. Glad to hear from you. Went up to see you Wednesday morning, but you had gone, I suppose. I asked old man Mr. Jackson where you were. He was cutting wood, never looked up, said you were gone. And then it kind of goes on, and they talk about this is my favorite letter, and he talks about, how are you and NM getting along? Is he the guy or not? Let me know. There's a masquerade down here. You must come down. And then they close again with your typical love to Mrs. Folks. Write and tell me all the news. Tom Cook died today. This is all. And it's again a very standard format compared to the rest of the letters.
And I'll just add, I mean, because you know, this is, I think, where so much I've spent my life so much in these materials. It's interesting that they do follow some very specific formats. There's a notification that your other letter is received. That's because of haphazard communication. You have to know what you're responding to. So sometimes letters are actually numbered. In other cases, it's just a reflection that I have received some materials, I'm responding to that. And then from there, sort of inquiries often about health, about well-being, sort of a conveyance of the pace of daily life, what's going on. And then things that we, I think, would put very differently today are often done in a very matter-of-fact way. So at the very end, Mr. Tom Cook died today.
Yeah.
But you see that a lot in both Black and white correspondence from the 19th and early 20th centuries. And again, I think, again, if you think about it, there's only a finite amount of space you're working with. Materials among certain socioeconomic classes can be rather scarce. You're not wasting a lot of paper. It takes time to sit down and write a letter. And so sometimes things are just like kind of boom, 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 boom in a way that I think we find jarring. But again, if you think about the historical circumstances, it actually does make a great deal of sense as to why it's conveyed, how it's conveyed. Can I zoom back out? Are you?
Yep, I'm good. So everybody else is okay.
Okay, so let me see where we're at here in terms of comments. So this letter, like the past one, is a bit shrouded in mystery. Yes, it seems as though she's now involved in another relationship.
Potentially. This is my favorite letter for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the mystery that's here. Because we don't get Dora's voice at all, this kind of gives her character a bunch of different layers. So it's written like it's from a woman. So we're wondering if MH is potentially the woman who becomes Israel's second wife, Mary Helen, or if it's somebody else completely. We don't know. We don't know who this other potential love interest is. Is he the man for what? We don't know who Moses is, Ella, Mrs. Folks. I think we generally might have an idea of Mrs. Folks, but it's very tangential. And we actually don't know precisely who Tom Cook is either. So it's completely mystery.
And I should say, in these cases, when you do go back to the official government local records, names like Tom Cook don't help you out.
No, they don't. There is a name that pops up in the records under Free Blacks. His name is Tom Cook.
Okay.
So, but the timeline is off a little bit. So we don't know if that's the Tom Cook, if it's a son or a relative of Tom Cook who has the name. We just don't know.
So tell us more broadly, what do you and your organization hope to accomplish with this project, and what can we learn, I guess, more specifically about African American life at the granular level in early 20th century Virginia from this collection? Because we've talked a lot about the voids in the source materials, the questions that remain, and those are important. And we don't always have to have a neat, tidy narrative, but give us some of the broad takeaways then.
Yeah, so I think kind of the driving force behind this project is in Clarke County, and I'm speaking very generally, of course, but in Clarke County, you get a very strong, rich white man narrative, right? They're plantation owners, they're from the Tidewater, and it makes sense. All the setup is there. But what you don't get are the people underneath of that who are really driving the county forward. And what we would like to see with this project is more of those voices come out. They don't need to be put on their own pedestal. They don't need to be elevated to some ungodly height, but they do need to be given a chance to tell us what their lives were like, and what Clarke County was like. We don't have a lot of people left alive from this time period, and if they are fortunate, I guess, or unfortunate, depending, to still, be alive and able to talk to us, how much of it do they remember? Like, there's not a lot of living memory left. And so these sources are what we have, and we need to do them the diligence of fleshing them out and giving them their chance to speak. And Clarke County Historical Association, and me, really want to see that happen. We want to see more of, I guess, the underdogs of history come out and really get a chance to give us some color. In a county that's so weird. Our history is not like anybody else's when you kind of look at it big picture. So yeah, I think it's time for them to come out. And
what is striking though is I spent my very first year, I think I was still ABD, I can't remember. I was at Virginia Tech, and Blacksburg, Virginia, so outside the valley really. And I can't remember the name of the county now, but a professor there, Dan Thorpe, wrote, he was writing it then, and it's since been published. It's a really good book. University of Virginia Press published it. And they had a similar phenomenon. Christiansburg, which is just south of Blacksburg, had that same demographic shift and that same mass exodus of African Americans sometime over the course of the 20th century. Yeah. And so what had been, what had been a very different community with a very different demographic picture changed entirely and looked very similar actually to Clarke County today. And
that's interesting.
It is. And whereas Frederick County, I think demographically has gone in a very different direction. But the pace of life in the valley and beyond in Western Virginia, the moving into West Virginia, it's a very complicated narrative, as you said. So it's just interesting to sort of gather these stories, and I guess more importantly, sort of tell people, as you said, what we see now isn't what was always there before. And so much of what we see now often drives the narrative forward that we don't understand we don't have a more holistic understanding of these regions.
Right, yeah, that's very much lacking in this area, especially in Clarke.
And I think this is the importance of local history, right? I mean, and I've often worked at the broader level, and I, to be honest with you, some of my favorite books are always community studies. I just think you can get so much more of the texture of daily life and drill down and start to reconstruct the pace, right, of these communities. And so I just want to spotlight how important the work is that you all are doing, I think.
And that's, to be honest, that's one of my absolute favorite parts of this job is, at one point I had aspirations to move on and do large organizations and, work at bigger name museums. But the more I got entrenched in the local history sites, and there's just so much there that nobody knows about. And there's so much to unpack, and it's really important. It's so great.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a good, hopeful place to end on, right?
Yeah, that is.
Okay. So again, my guest today was Melanie Garvey. Melanie, again, is an alumna of Shepherd, one of my excellent students, graduated from the Honors College and did just a fabulous capstone. She has aspirations for grad school. We're going to hear about that soon, hopefully. But again, the organization is the Clarke County Historical Association, and the project is called Letters to Dora. And if you don't mind, Melanie, I'll have you probably go onto Facebook later, and in the comments section, just post a link to what you're comfortable posting a link to, because I know the project's ongoing, but at least at Clarke County. And I want to raise that organization visibility. They've done some really good programming. I was an audience member for a program they did in the fall on George Washington's sort of military history. I brought my colleague and friend Ben Bankhurst with me, and my father actually, and we had a really lovely cup of coffee in Berryville. I'm trying to think of the name of the place.
Cordial coffee.
Yes. I had an Americano. Sorry, it wasn't even a coffee, it was an Americano.
They're good. They're a nice local spot.
Yeah. So with that, thank you to you all. Again, I'll be back in West Virginia soon with more stable internets. I know the video is a bit jumpy. And Pete liked my shirt, so thank you, Pete. And again, I'm just so proud of our students at Shepherd. Melanie has stayed in touch for several years now. I've sort of followed her career and her development and her progress, and I'm just so always thrilled to be able to bring them back onto the show and show what wonderful public historians in many cases they've become. They've also pursued a whole host of careers, but those I think I stay closest to are always in the history community. So thank you, Melanie, for being a good shepherd of Shepherd, and
absolutely,
for doing such an important project. Again, I really think it's critical, especially at this juncture in the American experience, to uncover these voices that are often rendered voiceless, right? Because of gaps in the archival record, because of our collective historical memory. And so I just applaud you all and your organization. And to everyone else who's tuning in, as always, sort of stay healthy, stay safe, and stay well. We have another program coming up later this week on George B. McClellan, so we're switching gears pretty radically, but we have a really good roundtable assembled of Ethan Rafus, Tom Clemens, Kevin Pollock, an alumnus of Shepherd, and my friend Brian, who works over at Antietam National Park Service. So I'm pretty happy about that. And again, thank you to you, Melanie, and thank you to our audience. And with that, I will wish everyone a wonderful and safe afternoon. So bye-bye.